Women are natural facilitators and natural relationship builders.
I don't think any of us knew at the beginning that we were going to be part of a wave or part of history. We just knew that we had to do something.
Hello, I'm Bonnie Urbay. Welcome to the Contrary. This week, we continue introducing you to the freshman women in the U.S. House of Representatives. Today, we introduce you to new members Susan Wild of Pennsylvania and Kim Schrier of Washington. We begin with Representative Wild.
You're one of four incoming female fresh women into the new class, the class of 2019. How, and that's Pennsylvania.
Right.
From 0 to 4.
Right.
Do you have a perspective on how that feels?
It's long overdue. We have had women in Congress from Pennsylvania in the past. Most recently before us was Allison Schwartz. And this year, 4 of us made it through the primary and through the general. Mary Gay Scanlon, Madeline Dean, and Chrissy Houlihan, as well as me. And the 4 of us have gotten to know each other very well. Pennsylvania has 18 congressional delegations, and until this year, for the last several years, has had 0 women.
What do you think President Trump had to do with your election?
My district is very purple. It is a 50-50 registration district pretty much, with a sizable number of independents. My sense is that it was more about people who really responded to my message about working for working families. Our district is very much composed of families who depend on their paychecks to get by, and it's not a particularly wealthy district. And I think it was a response to the message. Do I think there's frustration among a lot of the voters? Absolutely. I don't know that it's partially, I think, a reaction to the president, but it was as much about feeling that Washington wasn't moving forward on the working people's kinds of issues that I was talking about and care so passionately about.
Yes, but President Trump also promised to bring back coal jobs and make improvements. He always wanted to abolish what's now referred to as Obamacare, but he said he'd make improvements and make health care more affordable, get the middleman out. So do the red voters in your district feel that he has done right by them?
Well, I think that the only way I can answer that is to say that I won by a 10-point margin, and I'm in a district that's almost 50-50. So clearly there are Republicans in my district who feel as though he and the Republican-led Congress have not lived up to what they promised. Healthcare is the #1 issue in my district, and there are a lot of important issues, but that was a very significant issue and is obviously a high priority for the new Congress.
Explain to me, in Pennsylvania anyway, how did it go? And this happened, of course, nationwide, but when President Trump ran for office, he was full force against Obamacare, and Republicans promised to do away with it. And then 2 years later, everybody wants it. How did that work?
I do believe there were a significant number of people who did not realize that Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act were one and the same. I think there were a lot of people who were reacting to the fact that the price of health care has most definitely gone up. There's no question about that. But that didn't realize that a repeal of the ACA would include taking away protection for pre-existing conditions and would take kids off their parents' policies before the age of 26. I think when the education process started and people really started to recognize the impact, they found that to be unacceptable.
Are women's rights, advancing women's rights, tolling the statute on the EPA, for example, access to women's health, to have birth control included in health insurance, are those big issues for you?
Very much so. I consider myself to be a very strong advocate of women's rights and women's health care. I ran as a proud pro-choice candidate, and I feel incredibly strongly about the idea of having reproductive care provided as part of our national health care system, because it's just, it's clear to me that, and it's not just about reproductive, it's all issues pertaining to women's health, because it becomes an economic issue. It becomes an issue of whether women can become educated. It becomes an issue of whether they can get into the workforce and then remain in the workforce.
Do you have many persons of color in your district?
We do. It's certainly not a majority-minority district, but we have a large Hispanic population in the city of Allentown, primarily Puerto Rican, but also a strong number of Dominicans and other Mexicans and other Latinos. And our African American population is also fairly sizable in both Easton and Allentown. So I would say that issues that affect people of color are very much something that I care about, and that people will expect me to pay close attention to as things go forward.
How are those mainly economic issues as well? Or what?
They are.
What are the other issues?
There are a lot of issues having to do with criminal justice reform. There are voting rights. I have very enthusiastically signed on to what will be H.R. 1, which is Congressman Sarbanes' act, part of which is aimed at restoring a full Voting Rights Act. And that's a critical issue in our district. School funding, which is primarily a statewide issue, but there is definitely, it has a component at the federal level, is also very important. We have a distressed school district in the city of Allentown, and we need to do something about that.
Where's the money going to come from? Should it come from the feds or from the state, or
it's going to
from
have to
local
be
taxes?
both, and it's not just about our school districts in our district. It's across the country. I have always strongly felt that a child's education should not be dependent on the zip code that they live in. And in our district is a perfect example of how that works. We have a very affluent school district, a couple of very affluent school districts right next to a distressed school district. And I just think that's unconscionable.
So what's the answer? Is it to get rid of basing the amount of income that a school gets on taxes, real estate taxes?
Well, again,
so that all schools have equal amounts of money per pupil coming in?
The nexus between education and property taxes is a state issue. I do think that that's something that has to be closely examined, because certainly in Pennsylvania that accounts very much for the unequal funding for the school districts. But I also think that the federal government has to look at its role in education and in making sure that we are doing what we need to do to support the states as they go forward.
How do you feel about the self-described socialist wing of the Democratic Party?
The Democratic Party is a big tent party, and I believe that there is something to be said for having a very diverse group of representatives, because it challenges us. It forces all of us to ask questions of ourselves. And I'm not just referring to the self-described socialist wing of the party. I'm also referring to the more conservative members of our caucus. I think that it's really important to have different groups of people represented, and that's one of the reasons I identify as a Democrat. I have for my entire adult life. And I do think that it's important for us to be aware and to listen to people with different points of view.
You know, you responded to part of my question about incoming Speaker Pelosi and former Speaker Pelosi. But do you think, did she face sexism? Did she face ageism?
Yes, I do believe she did. I think that any man who had accomplished as much as she has accomplished in her career, although still subject to media scrutiny, as every speaker is, would not have been the subject of the level of attack and viciousness that I think she has been subjected to.
And do you think it was all from Republicans or
No,
Democrats
no,
too?
no. I can tell you that I have heard from Democrats, independents, and Republicans on the issue. I will also tell you that many people who privately weighed in with me by text, messenger, that kind of thing, telling me that they really hoped that I would support her. But I certainly also heard from people who felt that it was time for her to move on. And then I heard from people mostly during the campaign who were very anti-Pelosi, and most of those people were on the other side.
So issue number one for you, is it health care?
Issue number one is right along the lines of this H.R. 1, and that is democracy reform, because I think it affects every single decision and vote that we take.
Do you think there's still a lot of voter suppression going on in parts of this country?
I'm concerned about it, yes. I am, even in Pennsylvania, which I don't think has had specific voter oppression, it is not a particularly voter-friendly state. We have a very difficult absentee process. We don't have early voting. And having had relatives and friends in other states where they voted weeks before the election and were actually able to come out and work on my campaign, to me, I talked to them a lot about their access to the ballot box. And it clearly, so I don't know that I think of it as voter suppression in the way that we're hearing perhaps in Georgia and North Carolina, but voter suppression can take very subtle forms, and one is just to make it harder to vote. And I do think that there's a lot of that across the country.
And you've had a taste of this already, because so many of the freshman Democrats are women, but with more women, way more women in the House than there have ever been in this country. Mm-hmm. How's that going to change things?
I will say that I think women are natural facilitators and natural relationship builders. We also have the youngest incoming class that we've ever had. And I find that the younger men are every bit as good at it as the women are at the relationship building and that kind of thing.
What do you think you will be able to accomplish in terms of health care? I mean, so much of the ACA was stripped away by Republicans. What needs to be reinstated? And do you think you have a chance of getting it done, at least in the House?
I do. I think that it's a very high priority of this incoming Congress. Not just restoring the ACA, but improving upon it. I do believe we need a public option.
Clarify for me, please. What parts were taken out that need to go back in?
Well, the coverage for pre-existing conditions has constantly been under threat.
But it's still there.
It's still there. I think that we have to get back to the subsidies, because what's happening is that it's becoming ridiculously unaffordable in those states that do not have competitive markets. So I think that, but I don't think we should just take the existing structure and try to rebuild it. I think it's worth looking at it with fresh eyes and trying to build upon it and improve it.
Do you think Democrats will be able to move to a single payer system, which many want?
I think that if we're ever going to do it, it's going to be this, if not this session, the next. I think you're going to see substantial progress on it with this Congress.
You represent a purple district. Does that mean you're going to be doing a lot of walking down the middle sometimes?
Well, listen, it's my job to represent the people in my district. There will be some things that I have more liberal views on, some things that I have more conservative views on. But ultimately, my job, and I recognize it, is to listen to the people of my district and make my votes accordingly. That means in a 50-50 district that there will always be some people who are not entirely happy with a vote, and that's okay. When it comes down to that, when it comes down to an issue of almost equal division between my constituents, I think it will ultimately have to come back to my own core principles and what I think the right thing to do is.
Do you fear Democrats could overplay their hand, having had elected more Democrats to the U.S. House in an off-year election than have been elected since a long time ago.
Well, anybody who's not concerned about that on the Democratic side is fooling themselves. I think we have to be. We can't overplay our hand. We also, I think, have to be very careful to listen to the people on the other side of the aisle, get to know them, try to understand some of their motivations. There will always be people I won't be able to see eye to eye on anything, but hopefully there will be people who I can. The other thing, even more than overplaying our hand, is that I think Democrats need to not take anything for granted and not become complacent. There is nothing worse than a winner who gloats. And so I believe very strongly that we have to accept the mandate of the American people, that they were ready for change without losing sight of the fact that there are still a lot of people out there who think that things are going just great. So it's a tight wire for lots of us, but I think that we can do it with a lot of very careful, deliberate thought.
Now to our interview with Representative Schrier.
I've been taking care of children for almost 20 years and never thought I would do anything else except maybe one day retire and teach.
Kim Schrier is the new U.S. Representative for the 8th District of Washington State.
The 2016 election was a big turning point because I believe that the policies of this administration without checks and balances are a real threat to children and to families everywhere. And that ranges from healthcare to environmental policies to education policies. And I did what a lot of people did by calling, meeting with my congressman's office. It was really when the steady drumbeat of attacks on the Affordable Care Act came, and when that first Trump care bill came out that would have taken protections away from people like me with type 1 diabetes, with a pre-existing condition, from so many of my patients, that I met with my member of Congress and as a doctor, and I went with 3 other doctors, and I thought we would have a real influence.
A few days later, Schrier found herself disappointed when that member of Congress voted to repeal portions of the Affordable Care Act.
I decided, well, you know what? Who better than a pediatrician with type 1 diabetes to speak to this issue, and I'm going to run against him. And look where we are now.
Schrier says she still feels like a pediatrician and is just getting used to the word representative. Her family has had to make accommodations, too.
I have a 10-year-old son, and we contemplated this as a family. We knew that me running for office would mean that my husband would be a full-time stay-at-home dad, would take over much of the responsibilities, and that this would be it would be tough for the family. I believe that being moms is what compelled so many of us to run, because we saw this country changing, and the country that we know and love was becoming different, and I think we all wanted our kids to grow up in a place with respect for others, with a clean environment, where we joined a global community and didn't distance ourselves from it, where everybody gets health care, where our public education system stays great.
Schrier joins a robust group of female freshman lawmakers in Washington, D.C.
I'm really excited to be part of this freshman class, especially with so many. This is really a moment in history, and I don't think any of us knew at the beginning that we were going to be part of a wave or part of history. We just knew that we had to do something. I hope that we see more women on both sides of the aisle. And so I hope that my colleagues in the House look at our side and think, you know, maybe we could have a more broad appeal or be a bigger tent if we brought in more women. And then we women look at this and think, wow, we can collaborate well together, and wouldn't our government work differently if we had more women represented? When women are in office, we address issues that matter to women and families. And so yes, things would be different.
The 116th session of Congress got off to a slow start due to the government shutdown, but Schrier says she and her Democratic colleagues are clear about their priorities.
I believe it is our job right now to really focus on the issues that affect all families. And if we focus on the issues that matter to families all over this country, raising wages, making our public education great, bringing health care, making sure that no families go bankrupt because of medical expenses, that we bring down the cost of prescription drugs, I think it would be hard to not have those be bipartisan efforts. And if this administration, if our president vetoes these bills, or if they won't get to the Senate floor for a vote, which is entirely possible, I look at this as really setting the stage for 2020.
As for camaraderie and mentorship,
I am still getting to know all of my colleagues. This is still pretty new, but I have had dinner with Kathy McMorris Rogers, who is in my Washington delegation. I met with Jamie Herrera Butler. We all three are passionate about the well-being of children. And I think that is an area where we could get broad bipartisan support. And so I'm hoping to wade across the aisle and work together, and that'll be a starting point. I am really enjoying this journey, and it starts with my colleagues, both the colleagues in my class, because we are such a diverse, energetic, well-rounded, and very just grounded group. But we're joining these colleagues who have been here for years and who are so excited to now have the majority and who have been working on some of this legislation for a long time and now feel so gratified that we can start moving forward. And so it's great to feel that camaraderie. It's great to feel the optimism of knowing that our government is working better and that we can have checks and balances back and that Congress is doing its job. And it's great to think about a more optimistic future for my child and for all the patients that I have taken care of.
as a member of the Agriculture Committee, Representative Schrier has an opportunity to work directly for her constituents.
Today's bill has to do with the Yakima Basin Plan, which is legislation that has been in the works for years. And what's really special about it is that water is a scarcity in the eastern part of my district, in the drier part of the state of Washington. And we are an agriculturally rich district and state. And we're going to see this in a lot of parts of our country. And what's unique here is that we know that we have a warming climate, that we will have more water struggles in the future. And so proactively, stakeholders from all different backgrounds, people interested in fish habitat, farmers, municipalities, everybody has really come together to figure out how to not just conserve water, but also how to allocate resources in the future and make sure that we still have salmon habitat and that salmon could get to Puget Sound for the orcas, and that our farmers have the water they need, and that they're also conserving in a way that is responsible. And it's just beautiful to see all these diverse interests come together for the good of our state, and I'm thrilled to support that.
And she'd like to use her position on the Education Committee to help educate people about global climate change.
That is more and more the case. We are seeing wildfires now every year, and we worry about our snowpack. Not necessarily this weekend, but we worry. And I think that I'm on the Education and Labor Committee, and I think one of the things we should think about is beefing up science curricula so that schools across the country will look at their own microclimate and how it will be affected by our changing global climate. I think that's a really instructive lesson about what would happen, and kids can talk with their parents, and we can take on what is really an incredibly urgent issue and our responsibility to the next generation.
And what surprises the Congresswoman?
I would say a couple things. One is that it is chaotic on the floor of the House. It is noisy and chaotic, and things move quickly, and that was a surprise to me. I imagined everybody sitting in their chair in a very serious manner, but there is a lot of discussion that happens on the floor. And the other is the way that a congressperson's calendar is, that you actually can have 4 meetings all scheduled at 4 o'clock. And somehow managed to make all 4 of them. So it's a chaotic schedule.
That's it for this edition of To the Contrary. Please follow me on Twitter and visit our website, pbs.org/To the Contrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next week.